Hello, my friends. Hello, my friends. This is Deepak Chopra, and we are continuing our series, conversations between scientists and philosophers and anybody who has anything to say that's original and intriguing and gives us food for thought, expands our awareness. So today it's my great pleasure, delight to welcome Shiva Meucci. And did I pronounce your name correctly, Shiva?
Excellent. I've heard many different pronunciations, and that's one of the best ones.
Okay. So, we reach a lot of people here. You and I have conversations in that group of people interested in science, philosophy, spirituality. A lot of people don't know who you are. They don't know who I am. We reach a lot of people through these social networks. Ultimately, this conversation will reach about 15 million people. So I'd like to start just by asking you, um, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? Where do you go to school?
All
How
right.
come you're doing what you're doing now?
Well, I grew up in southern U.S. Actually, and around the Memphis area. And I grew up simultaneously in a farm, on a farm, and in a machine shop. So my family had both, and so I kind of had a start in mechanics and nature, sort of simultaneously, and that gave me a certain sort of perspective. And then with a lot of nieces and nephews, I ended up kind of getting interested in the development of intelligence because as I learned a lot about machining and things of that nature, I had this sort of view that it's very materialist, and it's sort of what I was hoping to talk about today, is sort of a very materialistic way of conceiving of spirituality. I eventually became a software engineer and did that for about a decade. And there was a point at which during that time that I was doing that, I was also constantly investigating science, because that was sort of being brought up in a fundamentalist Christian background. I ended up sort of finding that I was engaged in apologetics. So, that is figuring out how it is that you believe what you believe, why you believe what you believe, and going at it from a very science-based perspective, a very materialist science-based perspective. So I started kind of having issues with that and became more agnostic over time. And then, and this is while I'm, going through also being a software engineer. And eventually, I sort of had these, crises of origin and sort of my spirituality, and eventually got to the point at which I was I think I may have been an atheist for about a week. I think that was the longest I was able to maintain that as a because there was just a lot more going on. But so my spirituality sort of shifted over to physics. But then as I was going through and really investigating physics as my new belief system, I ended up running into some people who, behaved in a very religious manner there. And so that led me to later in life, after software engineering, I audited a 4-year neuroscience course. And that kind of gave me a perspective about how people believe, what they believe, and why they believe it. And at the same time was able to kind of establish a belief system that, though coming from a completely different perspective and background, that really tends to match yours in an analogy. I mean, it's a lot more materialist in its terminology, but by analogy, it is very similar to your own. And so I was inspired by a lot of your conversations and the things that you've been putting out for so long.
Where are you now?
Right now, I'm in the Sacramento area, so pretty close to Berkeley. That's how I ended up getting involved in the group that we talk in so frequently, and it actually started.
You live in Northern California then, right?
Yes, that's great.
May I ask how old you are?
I'm 45, I believe. Yes,
Okay.
45.
It's about the age of my son. And then how do you occupy your days these days?
Most of the time just writing, because it's been sort of a project of mine for the past 15 years to um, look at the way we can see an analog in physics. And it kind of goes back to something that you had in season 2, episode 1 of your physics and consciousness series, where it was a major win for me, because for the past 15 years, I've been trying to bring out one specific point at which we can change our interpretation of physics. And that is that question of the constancy of light. And that is whether it's isotropic or anisotropic. And it's something that we've talked about extensively in the group. And like I said, you brought up that Veritasium video, and that was really a major win for me, because I was like, oh, we're finally talking about it, because literally I've got probably 1,000 articles on Quora right now, and that's just one location. Of course, you've seen me write pretty prolifically elsewhere. And I've kind of taken it on myself to try to say, hey, there's this other way of looking at physics that is boiling under the surface, and I call it the neoclassical revolution.
So now let us enlighten us on your
All right.
thesis.
So I have some slides there that hopefully
let's look at them.
Yeah, all right. So hopefully people can go to that link that we've got, I guess, down there, where we can look at the slides. And one of the fun slides that I really enjoy here, if you go to slide 3, is it's a crisis of origin. I don't know if you've ever seen this little cartoon before, but it is a lot of fun, where basically you've got a circle there, and they've got it arranged into these two sides of real versus imaginary, and then this cycle of people sort of, establishing their hierarchy in this group. And it sort of starts at the theoretical physicists and mathematicians and ends at them, but it goes, oh, chemistry is just applied physics, and well, biology is just applied chemistry, and and each one of them, the physicists, the chemists, the biologists, psychologists, come all the way back around to the philosophers. And oh, theoretical physics is just applied philosophy. And then and then there's the cute little what's an experiment. It's a cute little demonstration of how there is sort of a cycle of reliance that isn't necessarily easily noted. You're not aware of how much a lot of people kind of think of their ground of truth as it's just factual, and they don't realize that there is this dependency that goes in a loop like that, because it's such a long list of dependencies. So there's kind of this crisis of origins that I went through myself, and I think that the same sort of thing is, I think that we all kind of go through crisis of origin, and eventually sort of end at this loop, and realizing that there is a place at which you can't really pinpoint one specific place.
So I'm looking at your diagram, and slide 3, and you say biology is just applied chemistry. So let me ask you a question. So chemistry, of course, in biology becomes biochemistry. Biochemistry is biophysics. Physics is biomathematics these days, anyway. Where is mathematics in the physical world?
Well, that is an interesting topic that we've recently been kind of going over in the group. And I didn't actually make this little diagram. This is just something I found that I thought was cute and fun. But mathematics, most of the time we'll say there's sort of a Western feeling that mathematics is the basis of reality. And we've recently just been sort of arguing, because I believe that there is geometry, and specifically information, is more what mathematics is representing, instead of the other way around. I don't think that the universe is made of math. I think that it is geometric and relational, but it is not mathematics per se. It's just mathematics works so much like that we're able to model it, and we're able to represent the universe in mathematics very well.
Would you say that mathematics is basically a human intellectual endeavor to look at um, at relationships, the patterns of relationship, both visible and invisible. Is that fair?
Exactly. Yes.
So it is an inquiry in consciousness, right?
Absolutely. So that's the thing that I hope that I'll be able to eventually bring to people, and maybe I'll actually just go through these slides on my own video at some point, is that I believe that there is a way to come to your viewpoint from entirely just a materialist, science perspective, and that's sort of along with my project to let people know about this one turning point in the philosophy of physics, which is basically interpretation. There's been this call for revolution for years and years. People have been talking about we need revolution in physics, but it's open, not like that. And they'll say not like that about basically everything that you might suggest. And but the thing is, I believe that revolution in physics will actually result in a revolution in spirituality as well. In other words, there is sort of the atheist materialist perspective that has sort of captured a lot of people's attention, and I think still has a way to achieve an understanding of what it is that you and so many others for thousands of years have been talking about, and we're just sort of arriving. And it's like, we engineers, we eventually get there, but we just take the long way around, So that's what I'm hoping to provide.
I'm looking at your collection of slides, and we're obviously going to put these up after we post the talk. And I'm just reading the titles because there's a lot here that we won't be able to discuss, but once in a while, maybe you can make a comment. And then I want to really get to the punchlines.
All right.
So, the first slide is reverse engineering mysticism, which means getting to spirit from matter. I have a question. How do you define matter?
Well, I really liked Frank Wilczek's definition as a starting point from there. But for me, matter is what ether is doing. So now, of course, I've used basically a dirty word here and said, in physics, it's, ether has been persona non grata for nearly a century now. But you had Wilczek on, and I was very happy because one of the things that he has here that says ether right there on his book, and it's it's because there has been this pervasive underlying idea of ether that has been coming back for many years. So like most people understand, Einstein got rid of ether. Well, actually he didn't. In 1905 is when his big paper, first big paper that came out about special relativity that theoretically people think of as that's what eliminated the ether. But in 1920, he said space without ether is unthinkable. And so in understanding how that perspective comes about, why was he still talking about ether so many years later? Why did he say, that constancy, why do we have this constancy postulate? And then later he talked about we needed to abandon constancy over and over, that it's incompatible with general relativity, which was in 1915. And so there's this sort of a confusion, and that's where one of my clearest and most straightforward papers is on the history of what I call the neoclassical interpretation, and it's and how it is that we can view this analog that's been there the whole time, and that people like Frank Wilczek, all of the physicists who are really at the edge of describing what's going on in our universe and trying to explore that, they all understand some version of ether, but most of the time, of course, like as I'm describing it, they're gonna want to argue with various things and say, oh well, but not like that. And so there's going to be difficulties that they're going to want to point out with some of the conceptions. But as I have on one of my videos with a physicist, there is a way to arrive at it. Once you start to get to the subtleties, that the idea of ether is still there. So then, what is ether? And it starts to get to ideas of information, which also is in Frank's book here, and then information. Well, then what exactly is information if that's not another way of saying spirit? How is that, if we start saying that we're made up of information, well then, what exactly is information? And so looking at spirituality and using, so you, a lot of times you like to use, technical terms and scientific terms to describe spiritual concepts, so people can understand this interplay. And I'm trying to use a sort of a complementary view and use spiritual terms to describe scientific concepts. And
So you would say ether is the fundamental ground which modifies itself, ultimately appearing as matter, right?
exactly.
So ether is equivalent of a field of possibilities that is modifying itself and ultimately shows up as matter. Would you?
Exactly.
Okay, now which book of Frank were you showing me? Because I
Oh,
just
this is Frank's. I'm sorry. This is Frank's Lightness of Being.
yes, I've read that.
Yeah,
So
and
last,
that's mass ether. Say
yeah,
again.
I interviewed Frank a couple of weeks ago,
Mhm.
and as you know, scientists keep revising their models, and so the latest thing from Frank is that the most fundamental nature of reality is just three things. He said: mass, charge, and spin. Actually, he said spin, charge, and mass. And
Mhm.
then he further went on to say that spin, charge, and mass are structureless entities where these properties reside. If they're structureless and they're fundamental to matter, are they material? Can we refer to anything as material? It has no structure, no mass, no energy.
Absolutely not. And the idea of the ether. Now, there are things that I would love to at some point have a conversation with Frank, because he's actually, I was so happy to see that you had him on, because I've been
I've had him on a few times, and he's a very personable person, and he's not dogmatic, but he still is a physicalist, despite
absolutely.
everything. Would you call yourself physicalist? What is a physicalist?
I would say I believe that there are two ways of looking at the universe, and that both are right. In other words, I believe that materialism is right within a certain framework, and I believe that spiritual first is right within a certain framework, because I don't believe that there is a separation between the physical world and the spiritual world. I don't think there's any separation whatsoever, and that we are just viewing a yin and yang sort of way of looking at things. So um, I don't consider myself either. I consider myself somewhere directly in the middle, and I think that trying to describe how to get there is very valuable, and that's sort of been my other mission. So I'm simultaneously, while I'm trying to say, okay, there's this other way of looking at physics, I think that that's also going to make it another way of looking at spirituality, and through the lens of a modern atheist materialist language, that can actually arrive at saying, wait, Deepak was right. But just if we take these terms and understand and map the analogy in this certain way, then we understand what he was saying fits with what we're now seeing deeply in physics. So and this perspective has it goes all the way back to 19th century physics. And that's actually sort of I have an edutainment project that I use, regarding steampunk, that is to try to get people interested in this perspective. And it goes, and then the part of my history paper is showing how it goes all the way from the 19th century physics, and then winds its way up through all of modern physics. And it actually, like Einstein, he spoke on Kelvin's birthday about how he had influenced topology, and how he was basically the progenitor of topology. Well, as he was doing that, as he was developing topology in the rudimentary aspects of it, he was trying to describe these vortices in ether. That's what his attempt was to do. With Maxwell, he talks about the electromagnetic medium is wheels, pulleys, and fluids. And so there's this perspective. And so even though those are materialistic ways of looking at things, just as you had said, it's like this medium, this pervasive medium that is forming itself, that the change in form as it is doing these things, that it ends up being where it is sort of making itself like a where's the beginning of a river? As a river is going down and cutting through, it is, it's shaping the riverbed, but the riverbed is also shaping the flow of the water. And so a river is creating itself. And so that sort of perspective is how I see the spiritual world and the physical world as two sides of the same coin.
So what you're basically saying is the spirit knows itself as the physical universe. The spirit is knowing itself as the physical universe. Would that be accurate?
That sounds accurate to me. Yes, that is that part of the things that you've been talking about, along with the universe viewing itself. All of these things make perfect sense and can be described in terms of all of the various physics theories that we've been developing all this time. It's just a different way. You just shift them just slightly, and you see your perspective come about in it.
So my very special guest today is Shiva Meucci, and he's a very articulate and very, I would say, diverse thinker. I'm just looking at all his slides: the neoclassical revolution, higher order logic, fluid dynamics, superfluid vacuum, a computational substrate, black holes and information, Akasha and Prana, neoclassical freedom, revolution, steampunk physics project. Much of this, by the way, is totally outside my pay grade. So what I'd like to do in the remaining time that we have, and I encourage everyone to look at these slides and send you questions and go on your website, because I'm going to. There's a lot of stuff here that I don't actually understand. As I said, I'm not well versed in many of these concepts, but I do want to come to 2, 3 things that I want to discuss with you. So, as you look at the landscape of philosophy, Western, Eastern, doesn't matter, and the evolution of science, we've had the physicalists starting with Aristotle. We've had the idealists with Bishop Berkeley and others. But, if I go deep into the origins of my tradition, non-duality, Vedanta, Kashmir Shaivism, actually it's neither idealism nor physicalism. It's what we call non-duality. That's all one thing, and it's not a thing. That what we call matter, what we call mind, what we call spirit is all one activity. And it's an activity that has its source in a domain of existence which is not in space-time, that even space-time, matter, information, energy are human constructs for modes of knowing and experience in consciousness. So before you call something a particle, you have to know it exists. And you derive, like these days anyway, Higgs boson and this and that, we're looking for particles. We actually first come up with the theories in consciousness, and then we derive empirical facts. It's not that we look at facts and come up with theories. So we come up with theories, then we derive the empirical facts through amazingly expensive experiments at the Hadron Collider. We look at something called a Higgs boson, which is half-life is less than 10 to the power of minus 20 seconds. By the time you observe it, it doesn't exist. And then you say gives mass to the entire universe. I'm just asking you a question. Is reality the way, say, Einstein perceived it, without being disrespectful of any of the great giants, but with the exception of few, the Copenhagen original quantum physicists, I think the entire scientific world is built on something that the philosophy of science would call naive realism, which means that we think the physical world is exactly how it's perceived by human beings, the human beings' 5 senses, and nothing more, their narrow bandwidth. Of course, we can extend that through instruments, but it's still ultimately a perceptual experience and a cognitive experience. And then we give names to our experiences. We say this is a Higgs field, this is a particle, this is an electron, this is gravity, this is a force field. But all we are creating is human models of something that is probably impossible to access through observation, because it is always the observer, and it is not only always the observer, it is the observer, the process of observation, and that observed all together.
Yeah,
And
and I think that there is a we can approach things, and in science we approach it asymptotically. We can get really close, but there's certain things that we have to believe that. Coming again from the materials perspective, where our brain is a computer, et cetera, in which there is a way in which you can conceive of that where it works with spirituality, and there's even a way in which you can conceive of a deterministic world that works with free will and spirituality, and that's actually a perspective I come from and try to describe over many pages, as you're aware. But I think that there is a direction that we can go that in which we can embrace both of the perspectives, and so that's just what I'm trying to describe here. And maybe I should go to some of the what was your point just now?
my point was that the universe that we call physical is a human construct, and not
Yes,
real, and not real.
that's
It's
right.
something we have created, along with Wittgenstein's argument, we are asleep, our life is a dream, but once in a while we wake up enough to know that we're dreaming, that the physical universe that we experience, you and I, is an entirely human construct. It's the human moon is the one I'm looking at. It's not a horseshoe moon, and it's not a crab's moon, and it's not a tree's moon. And so what we are doing is, as human beings, and particularly as scientists, we're taking perceptual and cognitive understanding, codifying it in mathematics and scientific language, and saying this is the real universe, when in fact it's our construct of what we think the universe is.
I have a very good example of that, and that's basically whenever we're dividing things. So like one of the things I like to bring up is that when a child looks up and sees two clouds, they've decided it's two clouds, but when they're very close to each other, there's small changes of perhaps how much light they're seeing through it. But is there really two? The way we divide things, a scientist could say, oh, well, there's this unbroken path between the two of them where the relative humidity is the same, the number of droplets, the number of absolutely everything's exactly the same. So it's just one cloud. And so we have this idea of how we divide things that is useful to us, but it's not necessarily true. And we have these ideas of truth, and it really comes down to our divisions because of the fact that we can't exist eternally. So we have this need to stop that cycle. So whenever you try to find the beginning of anything, you end up kind of going in this cycle. And science has said, well, we go back to the Big Bang, and then they stop there. Well, what happened before the Big Bang? And anytime that you hit one of these things, you have this problem of infinite regress, where you get caught in a loop. And this actually relates to Gödel's incompleteness theorem in a certain way, but I won't dive too much into that. But I believe that there is, looking at it once again from a materialist and programmer sort of perspective, that I believe we can actually accidentally lock ourselves into infinite loops, and then our brain has to find some way out of it. And that is basically saying that the way that we currently are in the smaller portion of us. So I believe there is this larger portion of us, and I believe that there is this smaller portion of us. And the smaller portion of us has some limitations sometimes by trying to act through this brain structure. And one of those limitations is this problem of infinite regress. And we end up running into the limitations of this smaller existence. But one of the other things that I really love, and that in talking about fluid dynamics and how that how that fits is that at the same time, our views of things are always messed up. And I wish we could show that picture of a fish. I don't know. Let me look on which slide this is, because it's really relevant right here. It's one of my favorite.
Which slide is it?
This is slide 14. So in slide 14, you'll see this black and white image of a fish seeming to swim upstream.
Mm-hmm.
And what's happening there is you're not actually seeing a fish swimming upstream. That fish is dead. It is only the motion of the water that's the real thing happening there. The water around it, the thing that surrounds it, that is the larger existence that's causing the swimming. And I find that to be fascinating, because my entire perspective of this fluid dynamical basis, this hydrodynamic basis for reality, is that our view of the universe is completely inside out, and that what matter is, the kind of end result of this perspective is that matter is sort of the foam at the edge of the universe, and that the edge of the universe is all kind of wrapped up inside this in what we see as matter. And so, in other words, the edge of the universe is the material world, but the real universe, the real thing, is actually the ether. That is what you would see as the universal mind, as the universal consciousness. And we're just seeing this borderline moving around. And just like you're seeing that fish, you think you're seeing the fish swim upstream, and to a normal materialistic perspective, that fish is swimming upstream, but that's literally a dead fish they've placed in that water. So it's the water doing it, not the fish. But we are like fish in water. All we see is this we don't see the ether around us. It's very difficult to detect. And that goes back to that specific place at which Einstein's, I believe you had said earlier about Einstein's view of the universe, is it, and there is Einstein we have as sort of this idol that doesn't actually represent his actual writings. And then there's the real Einstein, the man Einstein, and what he believed versus what we are taught that he believes are two completely different things when you start digging into the history. And so I believe the Einstein, the man, he actually did have more of a spiritual sort of perspective on things. But going back to the idol of Einstein, the false vision of him, there is this idea that he eliminated ether, which eventually, of course, that's not specifically what he was saying. And this comes down to Minkowski space-time. So, this is something that's come up in some of your other discussions, is space-time the right view? Well, there are certain assumptions, divisions, the way in which we look at the world in Minkowski space-time that may not be exactly the right way to conceive of things. And that goes back to that experiment where we have never tested the one-way speed of light. So therefore, Minkowski spacetime, which is based upon isotropic constancy, is actually just a belief. It is not empirical science. It is a belief, and that is a belief that the whole of modern physics is based upon. But it's just a belief that we don't have any empirical evidence for it. And that's why I believe that we could actually have this shift, and this shift will lead us to turning our whole worldview inside out and start to seeing that we are not this specific body, that this is just the convergence of something happening outside of us. We see this convergence point. We see, and what we're seeing is something bigger doing something. So just like matter is what ether is doing, we are what the universe is doing.
You quote actually Alan Watts over there that we are a fragment of activity that is universal. So having come thus far, and in your own personal investigation of reality, what is your definition of universal mind or God, and why is it even important?
Why is it important? My definition of God, I try not to define God. I believe we are all God. I believe that, but then to say, in more Eastern tradition, I am God is also, in my opinion, that's sort of Western religion tends to really dislike that, but I think that they don't understand the idea that you could be God's, fingernail and still be. If I just touch your shoulder here, you'll say, "You're touching me," right? But that's all I'm doing is touching those little cells, and so at the same time, the Western mind, they're okay with saying we are the body of Christ, or we are, but so there is this way of these two mindsets having conciliation and saying that we are all part of God, and but therefore we are God, and we are responsible for managing our tiny part of the universe. And so I think that is why it's important, is in understanding our larger self and our larger impact, and what we represent in the universe. There is a long-sightedness that is crucial to acting in a way that is categorically human, I suppose. And that is that when we are nihilistic, if there's been a point at which someone has gone through the dark night of the soul and become nihilistic, they begin to act more and more short-sighted, because they try to only consider just this one moment, and so there is sort of a loss of an eternal mindset, and attempting to be part of the universe and to have a positive impact on the universe, because in essence you are impacting yourself. And I mean, and this sounds like rational selfishness and things of that nature, and I think that's somewhere that our society kind of got confused in the West, where we started seeing short-sightedness as rationally selfish, but then things like game theory, especially evolutionary game theory, we began to start to understand that there are all these different things that can, and different roles that can unify into something larger, like a multicellular organism is not all the same, but it behaves in a way that protects all of the units. And so game theory pointed out to us this short-sighted, we had this one-shot game theory that was very simple, and it looked like selfishness was the very best way to go. But then as we get to larger and larger perspectives of ourselves, we start seeing more further and further into the future, and considering more and more and more individuals as part of ourselves. And so I think that is why understanding a view of God that is much larger, and having an idea of ourselves that's not nihilistic, that we're going to die, nothing matters, that short-sightedness becomes self-destruction very quickly. And if it's not self-destructive for just the individual, it is at least self-destructive for the society in which they reside. And so I think that there is a necessity to spirituality that gives us a different perspective, that right now our view is inside out, and the universe is a larger thing than we conceive of, and we end up getting too focused on this one little unit. And there's actually a quote I can read you here at the very bottom by Einstein, and that I really like. That's very relevant. It's a human being is part of the whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. So there is a view here that he has, and I'll just give just the first line of another quote I have here, which is, "The finest emotion of which we are capable is the mystic emotion." So Einstein did have, Einstein, the real person, did have a view of reality that is a little bit different than where we ended up. And it's funny that so much of it is misinterpreting his words, misinterpreting his intention, and then later on beginning to completely ignore him. And a lot of people may not be aware that as time went on, people started to completely ignore Einstein, not just about things like quantum mechanics, but also about his own theories. They started paying no attention to what he said his own theories meant, and so that's where I traced it back to this single point of confusion, where basically it's Poincaré was going to meet with Minkowski, but then Minkowski suddenly died, and they never got to meet. And so then there was this social uproar where Einstein had kind of insulted Minkowski by saying, when now that the mathematicians have gotten a hold of the theory of relativity, I don't understand it myself anymore. And that was, Minkowski was his mentor. And so this was an insult to this whole group, and they had it out in a public forum on Annalen Physik, and so he was kind of pushed by people to accept Minkowski's work, but Minkowski was developing something. It was kind of halted short, and so there's this misunderstanding of isotropic constancy versus anisotropic constancy, and that is there's an optical illusion of constancy that fits, where that's why we have this Lorentz Poincaré ether that is exactly mathematically equivalent to special relativity. There's two different ways of looking at it, but Einstein wasn't really commenting on certain things. He left that to Lorentz. That's why he just imports Lorentz's work, the kinematics, and then he works on his portion, which is the electrodynamics. That's why it's on the electrodynamics of moving bodies, because he was just using, it's like, okay, what Lorentz has found, that's neat. And just like normal science, you use a prior art and then you go forward from there. He was going forward from there, but then people took that to be too hard and fast. And then, I've got at least 5 different quotes from Einstein in his personal writings and elsewhere, where he said the principle of constancy must be abandoned. And so that's very confusing for people, because the Lorentz math says constancy in a certain way, but it's an optical illusion that has to do with exactly what you brought up the other day, which what I felt was just, I've been hammering away at this for 15 years, specifically trying to educate as many people as possible so that it becomes no longer a dirty word to say ether. And it was, that's why I was so excited about it. And that is specifically that idea that we cannot measure light in one direction currently with our current methods. We've only measured it in 2 directions. And so therefore, Minkowski's idea of space and time conjoinment is actually, once again, it's just an idea. It's not empirical science. So there's interesting things going on there that I hope I can get other people interested in.
So, when I asked you my last question, what's your definition of God? You refused to give me a definition, which is great, because any definition would be limiting, right?
Exactly.
Any definition would be limiting, and then to define God would be to limit God. But I like the fact that where you are right now, with all these diverse insights into thermodynamics, into mechanical science, physical science, engineering, quantum mechanics, mathematics, Gödel's theorem, that you are coming to a deep mystery at the heart of creation. So my final question is, and we could come back and do a question again. Actually, I have a couple of questions before we finish, because we can't go on for more than 1 hour. The first question is, do you think, the difference between you and me and a primate is like 1% of the genetic information? 99% of the genes in the chimpanzee, gorilla, are the same as you and me. With that 1%, we have created this huge scientific edifice. And we happen to be a species on a planet which is a speck of dust, I'm told, amidst 2 trillion galaxies, 700 sextillion stars, uncountable trillions of planets. On scale, I think we wouldn't be the equivalent even of COVID-19 size-wise on this planet. A speck of dust in what is apparently a mindless void, and explaining the mystery of existence to possibly to ourselves. And is this leading us to a place where the mystery of existence actually increases or is more knowable? Has science increased the mystery of our existence with all the things you're talking about? Look at all the things you're talking about, bringing them all together. Does that increase the mystery, or does that actually give us access to the mystery, or the mystery is the mystery and leave it to the Republicans to call it golf?
I think that I think we always have this impression that we're getting it hammered down, and people like to quote Kelvin and say that's like, oh, we're done with science, we finished that, and that's actually happened over and over and over, that we're done with science. And what is science? Science is our are delving into the mysteries, are trying to figure out what's going on. What is all this stuff? What are we supposed to do with it? And every time someone comes along and says, oh, we did it, we got it all figured out, it breaks open in this huge new vista of more things and more mysteries. And so I think that we may be expanding our understanding to a point at which it's going to suddenly make us know exactly how little we actually really do understand. In other words, we're getting to another one of those points where we're going to break through again. This has happened over and over. One of my favorite examples is spontaneous generation, where there was a period of time where we thought worms come from meat. That's good enough. We're done. And you could measure it, and you could figure out over time. You could actually come up with mathematics of how spontaneous generation works if you wanted to. And but the thing is, we can keep going deeper. You can keep going broader. You can keep understanding more. And I think that that's part of what existence has been doing. And the funny thing is that sort of, for me, gets to the heart of some of the things that people like to bring up. Is like, well, if there's a God, why is there suffering? I think that there is, if the question is more, if there is existence, there is balance. And that's part of the sort of a necessity of existence, is that if you have a pure white unchanging crystal plane, that could be perfect, and then there's no experience. And so I think that part of developing experience, if I were to ask myself, what do I think God is doing? In other words, what's the universe doing? Why is it doing it? It is to try to find the most beautiful way to balance things such that experience can be had, and exploring things that perhaps. I know some people always want to believe in God as absolutely omniscient. I don't necessarily personally know whether or not that's true, but it does feel as though that there may be things that even God is exploring. And so that's sort of all of the existence. Yes, we're coming to a point where we know better, and maybe we'll understand more. Maybe we're about to have this understanding that's going to really, really change us a lot. But will that reduce the mystery? I don't think so. I think it's going to expand it exponentially.
My final question, if we are part of something bigger, infinite, mysterious, and if we shift our identity and surrender to that bigger mystery, um, then perhaps there is existence beyond this bag of flesh and bones. And that is the real existence that we long for. Would you be sympathetic to that idea?
Absolutely. I believe that's one of my first papers was about that. I believe that the ether is a substrate in which information is being computed, and that information, just because we're at a computational point doesn't mean that what we are and who we are isn't also all throughout that larger system. And so, yeah, I believe in an idea of life after death. I believe in an existence that where basically here we are, ink in an inkwell, and we fear being spread out, and the inkwell being emptied and spread out and gone. But our existence as words on paper, is just not fathomable to something that's an inkwell.
My very special conversation today has been with Shiva Meucci. Look up his credentials, look up these slides, and be mystified and bewildered. I'd like to end today's conversation by thanking you and saying that you have actually increased my bewilderment. And I'm exchanging my cleverness for bewilderment once again, as the great poet Rumi said. And if you like the following title, let's go with it. A Conversation with Shiva Meucci, all the credentials. And then the title would be, and Carolyn is noting it right now. Let's call it Universal Mind, Einstein, Naive Realism, Surrender to Mystery, and Timeless Existence. How's that? It's a long title, but it'll intrigue people.
I like it. I like long titles. That's something, if they look at my papers, they're going to find it's like, wow, this guy really likes long titles.
Okay, so that's good. Thank you, Shiva. And I hope you were satisfied with the interview.
It's great. Great talking to you. And I look forward to talking to you again by text and otherwise.
Me too. And we'll send you Frank Wilczek's conversation. So give you some food for thought, and maybe we can expand on that in the future.